By the time the sun climbed over Arroyo Ford, the air already carried the sting of blood and onions thick enough to turn a man's stomach. The market buzzed beneath the heat canvas stalls, sagged under the weight of pork slabs, horse feed, and scuffed boots. Flies clung to every cut of meat, while stray dogs prowled for scraps. The noise and the smell mixed into something raw, something that belonged to this land. Cole Maddox rode into town slow, his gelding snorting against the dust. He didn't bother tying a tight knot at the post. No thief or beast would dare move much under that choking heat. Every motion of his carried the calm of a man who'd seen gunfire too close and learned the price of haste. His eyes swept the square, not for bargains, not for faces, just for exits. A soldier's habit, one that never left him. The murmur near the livery rail drew his attention. A cluster of men leaned against the fence boots, grinding in the dirt, breath sour with tobacco. Hank Dobbs, Lou Ramsey, Wade Harlan, and Brax Redmaw were there. Faces twisted in that half-mean boredom that comes before cruelty. At the center stood a woman, her wrists bound with rawhide hair tangled by the wind. Her deerskin dress was torn along the side, revealing bruises and ribs like silent accusations. And beside her, a man Virgil Tate read from a crumpled slip of paper, his voice loud with fake authority. Debt owed by her late husband, he said, like it was a sermon to be paid in coin or flesh. The crowd chuckled low. Cole didn't. He'd heard enough of that tone before, men hiding their fear behind rules and ropes. He walked straight through them, not pushing, not talking, just stepping between boots until he faced Tate head-on. The man faltered, eyes darting from Cole's revolver to the knife on his belt, the kind of blade that could gut a hog or a man without much difference. How much Cole's voice came rough, quiet, and final. Tate stammered. For the terms, Cole didn't wait. He pulled out a roll of bills, counted slow, until the paper shook in Tate's hand. The rawhide rope hit the ground, and the men stepped back, their fun gone cold. The woman raised her eyes to him. Sahi Redfeather. No fear, no gratitude, only a steady calm that belonged to someone who'd already survived too much. Name, he asked. Sahi, she said, voice hoarse but steady. Cole nodded, handed her his canteen. She drank carefully, like water still cost something sacred. Then he took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders, careful not to touch skin. Around them, the crowd suddenly found their boots fascinating. They walked away from the square, the whispering following them, until the noise turned to wind. As they passed the mercantile, Etta Miles, the storekeeper, with arms like hickory wood and a stare that could split men open, stepped out. She pressed a folded shawl into Cole's hand. No words, just a nod that said she understood more than she'd ever admit. The ride north was silent. The chill of dusk crept fast, the mare's breath fogging in the fading light. Dust and twilight tangled in Sahi's hair as she held the shawl close, eyes on the horizon, like she expected the sky to betray her. Cole pointed toward the dark line of hills. Cabins that way, he said. She didn't answer, just followed. By the time they reached his place, the sun was gone, and the cold had teeth. The cabin stood small and lonely, one-room, low-roof chimney, coughing smoke. 2 graves lay behind the cottonwood plain, wood markers, no names. Inside, warmth flickered from the stove, shelves stacked with jerky beans, salt. He hung his coat by the door and nodded toward the basin. Water's warm. While he stirred beans in the pot, she washed quietly, covering the tear in her dress with one of his old shirts. They ate in silence. No words, no glances, only the crackle of the fire. When it was time to rest, she lay on the bedroll by the wall, back against it, eyes open. Cole placed his knife on the crate between them, the blade closer to her than to him. Then he lay down, rifle within reach, listening to the cabin breathe. Sometime deep in the night, a board creaked. She sat up, hand on the knife. "Just the stove settling," he murmured from the dark. Her breath eased out, slow and careful. She lay back down. Neither of them slept for a while. He counted her breathing like a rhythm, something steady in a world that hadn't been steady in years. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was a start. Sahi Redfeather hadn't moved much through the night, but by dawn, Cole Maddox heard the faint rasp of fabric sliding over the floorboards and the sound of water being poured into the basin warming by the stove. He didn't rise yet, just listened, letting her have her quiet. When he finally sat up, she was already dressed, still wearing his old shirt over her torn deerskin dress. The shawl Etta Miles had given her was pulled snug across her shoulders. Her braid hung loose, brushing forward as she scrubbed the basin in slow, steady circles. She didn't turn when she spoke. "You sleep loud," she said, her tone flat as cold iron. Cole didn't answer. He didn't need to. He struck a match, lit the fire back to life, poured more water into the tin pot. Breakfast would be little more than coffee, and the last scraps of bread, unless he wanted to take the rifle out before noon. "I'll work for the food," she said, without looking up. "You don't owe me," he replied. Her hands paused, just a breath. "Doesn't mean I'll sit idle." He gave a short nod. "Fair enough." Outside, the sky had turned the color of worn pewter, heavy with the promise of snow before nightfall. He split logs while she stacked them. She didn't fumble or ask which way the grain ran. Each piece she wiped clean with her sleeve, like she believed even the smallest act of order could hold back the chaos waiting out there. Inside, she swept the cabin corners, shook out bedding, boiled old bones for broth, scrubbed the knife clean with salt. By midday, the silence between them had changed shape. Not tense anymore. Not empty, either. It felt like two people learning how to move to the same rhythm without ever saying how. Questions hung in the air, the kind no one spoke out loud. Who had tied her to that post? What kind of debt made a woman property? Why hadn't she run once she was free? And what turned a man like Cole quiet enough to scare even the silence itself? But neither of them asked. Questions like that weren't for words. Not yet. Cole walked over, set a spool of thread and a needle down beside her. She looked at it, then at him. "I used to sew better." He gave a small shrug. "Better than me," he said, and turned toward the doorway to check the sky. The cold had deepened by late afternoon. No snow yet, but the kind of stillness that warned it was coming. Sahi sat near the stove, mending the ripped seam of her dress, with tight, uneven stitches strong enough to hold, ugly enough to be honest. The neckline tear she left open, not by mistake, but by choice. A small, defiant V that bared the faint marks the rawhide had left on her skin. Cole kept his eyes elsewhere. Not because he didn't notice, but because looking too long would have felt like stealing, and he wasn't a thief. He went outside, boots crunching into frozen clay muscles, moving with the memory of trenches dug long before he'd ever built fences. From the doorway she watched him work for a moment, hammering posts into the half-frozen earth. His breath rose in clouds, his movements sure and patient. Then she turned back inside, swept the floor again, the sound of straw and boards mixing with the wind that had started to howl beyond the ridge. By late day, a rider appeared, an old man slumped in the saddle of a tired roan horse, scarf, crooked hat pulled low. "Cyrus Blackstone." Cole leaned his shovel against the fence as the man dismounted. "Goddamn fool thing you done," Cyrus muttered, before his boots even hit the dirt. Cole didn't argue. He just folded his arms and waited. She's Apache, Cyrus said, jerking his chin toward the cabin. Town won't let that sit quiet. The man she was tied for Sutton's brother. They'll be talking about contracts, papers, and property. She's not property, Cole said. Cyrus snorted. Tell that to the judge, or better yet, tell it to the men who think they own the law. Cole nodded once, calm as ever. You bring me the meat. Left it tied behind the saddle, Cyrus said, pulling off one glove and wiping his nose. They'll come, boy. Maybe tomorrow, maybe 3 days. But they'll come. She's ready, Cole said. She doesn't need to hide. When Cyrus stepped inside, Sahi didn't flinch, though she stood with her back, close to the hearth. He tipped his hat, murmured a rough greeting, and handed her the wrapped parcel of venison. She nodded in thanks, but said nothing. After the old man left, Cole stood at the window for a long while, watching the horizon fit beneath a bruised sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. The grave's out back, he said without turning. Wife, boy, fever took them. 3 winters ago. Sahi's expression didn't change. She just bowed her head slightly. My husband was shot, she said quietly. Men like the ones in town claimed he owed them for supplies. I buried him by the river, then ran. Neither of them spoke again. The wind picked up outside, pressing against the cabin walls like a warning that had come too late. Cole checked the latch twice, then once more, just to be sure. And when the snow finally began to fall, it came like dust, soft, steady, unstoppable. Before turning in, Sahi Redfeather set the kettle close to the fire and folded the shirt Cole Maddox had lent her. Keep it, he said with a wave of his hand. She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. That night, as the storm scraped against the roof and the wind howled like an old warning too late to heed, she didn't sleep against the wall. Instead, she moved her bedroll half a foot closer to the stove, not beside him, but near enough to share the warmth. When the stove cracked and settled, she didn't reach for the knife. She simply listened, counted breaths the way he did 2 souls pretending they weren't afraid of the same ghosts. Tomorrow they would work. Tomorrow the first test would come. But for that night, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was alive. By morning, the cold had sharpened its edge. Frost spread across the inside of the windows like white veins on old glass. The fire burned low but steady, and the quiet inside the cabin no longer felt like a stranger. It was familiar now. Not comfort, not yet, but something that didn't taste like danger. Cole rose soundlessly, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside before dawn to check the sky. A thin dusting of snow had fallen, whitening the stacked firewood and the half-finished corral rails. It wouldn't last, but it meant more was coming. Inside, Sahi had already lit the stove and swept the hearth clean. She moved with the careful grace of someone who had lived too long in borrowed spaces, touching only what was hers, measuring her steps, keeping her back near the wall. Yet the shawl from Etta Miles now hung on the peg instead of clutched around her like armor. That small change didn't go unnoticed. They ate breakfast in the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but earned born from 2 people who didn't need to fill the air to be understood. When they finished, Cole slid a small cloth pouch across the table. Inside were 44 cartridges, a folded note, and a dull-bladed penknife. If I'm gone too long, he said quietly, use what makes sense. She didn't touch it. Where town? He replied. Need wire for the fence. Salt, if they've got any. You go alone. Better that way. She gave a small nod, but asked one more question. What happens if they come asking? He met her gaze. I tell them you're free. And if they don't believe it, they can ride up here and see what that looks like. By mid-morning, he was gone, horse-cutting a line through the snow rifle across the saddle, where everyone could see it. Sahi stood in the doorway long after he disappeared over the ridge, the wind tugging at her hair, the call of a hawk echoing over the cottonwood. The cabin felt hollow without him, but she didn't sit idle. She boiled water, cleaned the rifle, then began stitching the torn edge of her sleeve. The thread bit through the fabric, steady, purposeful. She paused once, reaching into the small pouch she kept close, pulled out a scrap of buckskin, 2 tiny beads, and a twist of red thread from a shirt her husband once wore. She held them for a long moment, not crying, not speaking, just remembering, then tucked them back inside. The afternoon brought footsteps, not Cole's. She heard them crunch over the frozen ground before the knock came slow, deliberate, without respect. Her hand found the knife on the crate before she opened the door. 3 men stood outside. One wore a derby hat and held a roll of papers. Another had a smug grin. The third carried a rifle slung carelessly across his shoulder. "Ma'am," said the man with the papers, Silas Crow, by the look of him, his eyes avoiding her face. "We're here on a matter of debt and ownership." Sahi's hand tightened on the frame. "A man already paid." "Did he sign?" Crow asked, his voice oily. "No signature, no satisfaction. The law in Arroyo Ford doesn't run on favors or kindness." Behind them, a low growl rumbled through the air. Cole's dog had crept out from the trees, hackles raised, teeth bared. The rifleman shifted uneasily. Crow took a step back, his confidence faltering. "We'll return with the judge," he warned. The man with the smirk spat in the snow. "This ain't over, lady." They turned and left, boots crunching away through the frost. No bullets fired, but the threat was as clear as the cold. When Cole rode back before sunset, Sahi stood on the porch, hair whipping in the wind, the rifle propped against the doorpost, the pouch heavy in her pocket. She told him everything, every word, every face. He said nothing for a long while, jaw-tight, eyes dark. Finally he spoke. "I'll ride in tomorrow." "With you?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Because this isn't about who owns you. It's about who listens when you speak." They rode into town the next morning, side by side, in wordless rhythm. Cole Maddox kept his rifle visible across his saddle. Sahi Redfeather wore her shawl draped high across her shoulders, not for warmth, but for pride, a quiet banner in a place that still whispered her name like a sin. At the justice's office, Etta Miles was already waiting, arms folded, eyes sharp as flint. She handed over a folded slip of paper, the corners smudged from travel. "2 witnesses," she said. "They saw the sale. Said the money was paid, and the woman spoke her own name. Judge Garin Flint." A thin man with tobacco-stained fingers and no stomach for trouble scratched his head, sighed, and muttered, "Fine then. She's free, so long as she says it herself." "I say it," Sahi replied without a heartbeat's pause. That was that. No applause, no smiles, just freedom signed in ink and silence. On the ride back, the snow began to drift again, light but steady. Cole broke the quiet. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, "after I cut you loose?" She kept her eyes on the road ahead. Because nowhere else had fire. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had settled over the valley. She unpacked the flour, the salt, a spool of new thread. He set down the coil of fence wire by the post pile, the wind biting hard enough to taste iron. Inside, the scent of stew filled the room while he fixed the door hinge that had split under the cold. Without turning from the stove, she asked, "Do you trust me now?" He paused, hammer in hand. "I trusted you before." That earned the faintest smile, small but real. That night she rolled her bed beside the stove, close enough for warmth, but not for touch. He let the fire burn longer than needed, and when he finally lay down, the light still danced on the ceiling. Because nowhere else had fire. Morning brought thin blue light creeping across the floorboards and smoke curling soft from the stove. The kind of cold that made a man's breath break in clouds and timber crack like gunfire. Outside, Cole stacked the last of the cured planks, breath fogging in the brittle air. Inside, Sahi hummed low while she wiped the counter's no-tune-just sound. She had fallen into routine too quickly, sweeping, mending, boiling strips of cloth in salted water for wounds that hadn't come yet. Cole sometimes watched from the porch, not out of doubt, but understanding. She was a woman who'd lived in too many places that never lasted. She never fully unpacked her small pouch, always hidden in her skirt, her eyes darting to the door every time it moved, even when it was only the wind. By mid-morning, he came in snow falling from the brim of his hat. "Corral's finished," he said. "You want to ride fence with me?" She looked up from the beans soaking in the pot. "You sure?" He nodded. "You've been waiting on something. Figured this might be it." 10 minutes later, she stood by the gelding fingers, brushing its flank like she was testing an old memory. "He had a horse," she murmured. "Called him Hawk. Fast and mean." She didn't speak her husband's name, and Cole didn't ask. He just handed her the reins. She adjusted the saddle strap, mounted cleanly, without help. They rode north toward the tree-lined snow crunching beneath hooves' fence posts, fading into the brush. Neither spoke for the first mile. It wasn't silence, it was space. At a broken post, Cole dismounted, studying the split wood. "Elk rub," he said, pointing to the gray hairs snagged in the bark. Sahi crouched beside him. Fresh. She noted her breath turning white in the cold. "You learned that in the war?" she asked. He shook his head. "Learned it losing cattle." She rose again, eyes narrowed on the distant ridge. "What happened after they died? Your wife and boy Cole took his time before answering. Sent word to her sister in Texas. She never came." "And you stayed?" Sahi said softly. "Someone had to keep the land. I wasn't about to give it back to the men who stripped it bare before." She looked away, voice lower. "That's what I did, stayed too long somewhere I should have left sooner." They rode on the snow, deepening the world, dimming into gray silence. Cole reined in, nodding toward the far ridge. "Used to be a lookout up there, cavalry scouts. You ever see it? I know it," she said. "My uncle trapped in those woods before the white crews came, railmen, bounty riders, folks who wanted the valley empty so they could cut trees without asking." Her words were sharp, but he didn't flinch. They rode on together through the whitening wind, the forest closing around them, the rhythm of hooves and breath steady as one. By late afternoon, they were back at the cabin. The gelding stomped restless from the cold. Inside, the beans boiled slow, the air thick with wood smoke. Sahi moved with less hesitation, now no longer a stranger to the space, but not yet calling it home. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, hair tied back, cheeks flushed red from the cold, but her eyes steady, unyielding. Then came a knock. Cole Maddox reached the door in 3 strides, hand resting on the rifle, but it wasn't trouble. It was Etta Miles, bundled in thick wool, her breath misting in the frozen air. The judge signed off on everything she said, holding out a folded paper. "Figured you'd want it in your own hands." Cole took the document, scanning the rough scrawl of Judge Garin Flint's signature. The ink was still wet. Sahi Redfeather stepped closer, keeping just behind Cole's shoulder, but not hiding this time. Etta's sharp eyes caught the gesture and softened. "Men are still talking," she said. "But not to any judge that matters." Thank you, Sahi said quietly. Etta gave her a long, measuring look, then nodded once. You keep feeding him. Maybe he'll survive another winter. That night, Cole placed the signed paper on the shelf beside the rifle, not as proof, but as something she could see without having to ask. Sahi sat by the fire shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her fingers working carefully through one of his old shirts, a torn seam from hauling wood. Her stitches were slow, neat, deliberate. Cole watched her from his chair near the window, the firelight drawing gold across her cheek. You always this quiet? She asked, still focused on the fabric. Not always, he said. Just never met someone who listens better than they talk. That earned her the smallest smile. I was married 3 years, she murmured. He never learned that. You miss him? A pause. I miss not being afraid all the time. Cole looked away. The stove popped softly, filling the silence between them. She folded the mended shirt, stood, and crossed to where his coat hung by the door. Can I put this here? She asked, holding her small leather pouch. He nodded. She hung it on the same peg beside his coat, 2 things now, side by side. Not just hers. Not just his. That night she didn't unroll her bedding apart from his. She set it down beside his cot without a word. He didn't move, but he didn't stop her either. And when the wind tore through the seams of the roof, rattling the boards, neither reached for a blade. Not this time. The snow held for days, crusting the roof, frosting the windows until the light bled through in blurred streaks. Cole rose first, as he always did, but slower now, careful of the second shape beside him. Sahi slept with one hand tucked under her cheek, the other resting lightly against the edge of the quilt. She didn't flinch when she stirred. Her eyes opened, met his, and she said softly, Still snowing. Just fact, not fear. He made the coffee. She fried corn cakes. Neither spoke much, not because silence was heavy, but because it belonged to them now. By mid-morning, they were outside clearing a path to the woodshed. The drifts came up to her calves. She shoveled while he carried wood. When he slipped once on the ice, she laughed. Quiet, surprised, almost shy. He looked up, shaking snow from his coat. You think that's funny? You looked betrayed, she said, grin flickering. Like the ground turned on you. I forget to watch my footing sometimes. Then remember next time, she teased. He paused, his breath misting in the air. I plan to. I've got reason to now. That stopped her for a beat. She met his eyes, then nodded once. That was enough. Inside the fire burned hot again, the stew simmering with the scent of cedar smoke beans and thawed onions. She scrubbed the table while he fixed a window hinge. Outside, a raven landed on the fence rail, shook the snow from its wings, and vanished toward the cottonwood. Neither mentioned it, but both watched it go. Then by mid-afternoon, change came knocking again. A small figure appeared at the edge of the ridge, a girl no older than 7, wrapped in 2 heavy furs, riding a half-starved mule. She slumped forward in the saddle like someone who'd been riding far too long. Cole saw her first. His brow furrowed as he stepped off the porch, snow crunching under his boots. The mule stopped near the post sides, heaving. The girl didn't speak, just slid off, stumbled, and stood. Dried blood marked her lip, and her right hand was bound in a filthy strip of cloth. Sahi moved before he did. Get her inside. Cole carried the child in, setting her near the stove. She didn't cry or ask where she was, just stared at her torn boots, one sole barely hanging on. She yours? Sahi asked quietly. Cole shook his head. Never seen her before. But she knows you, Sahi said softly. He looked down at the girl again and for a long time didn't answer. "No," the girl said at last, voice hoarse, but certain. "He told me to come here. Said the man in the stitched coat would help." Cole Maddox crouched to meet her eyes. "Who told you that, old man?" she whispered. "Up by the ridge." Her voice cracked. "He died in the night." Sahi Redfeather knelt beside them. "Where's your people, child? Gone?" The girl breathed. "House burned. Mama too." Neither of them asked more. Some stories didn't need questions. That night they made a place for her near the fire, bread soaked in broth, 2 quilts tucked tight. She fell asleep, hard limbs twitching like a puppy, chasing ghosts in its dreams. Cole stood by the stove long after her breathing evened out, staring into the fire. "That ridge," he muttered, "she must have come through Cyrus Blackstone's land." Sahi looked up. "You think it was him could have been? Might have sent her here when he knew he was done for. Even for her to bury him." Maybe Cole nodded. "Could be." They stood side by side in the orange glow, watching the girl's chest rise and fall. "You think we're meant to raise her?" Sahi asked softly. "I don't think anything's meant," he said. "But she's here. And we're here." Sahi met his eyes. "Then that's enough. Don't ask if I'm sure. I stay, that includes her." Later. After the cabin quieted, Cole stepped outside. Snow was falling again, just light flurries drifting down from the black sky. He looked at the house, smoke curling from the chimney, 2 pairs of boots by the door, and now a 3rd, smaller pair drying by the hearth. When he came back in, Sahi was kneeling by the fire, her pouch open needle in hand. She was sewing a loop of red thread into the girl's torn sleeve. Cole knelt beside her, said nothing, just watched. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a strip of cedar wood. "For the names," he said quietly. She nodded. 3 now. He set the plank on the table. Tomorrow he'd carve it not to claim, but to remember. Because sometimes a fire wasn't just for warmth, it was proof the house wasn't empty anymore. The girl's name came 2 mornings later, half asleep, clutching a tin cup of watered-down coffee. She'd mumbled it between sips, trying to sound grown. Cole had asked how old she was. She'd only shrugged. Then Sahi asked gently, "What's your name, little one, Naya?" she whispered. Just that, nothing else. No last name, no story of where she'd come from. The way she gripped that cup said enough. She hadn't owned much that was hers in a long time. Outside, winter dug in deeper. Snow buried the old trail toward Cyrus Blackstone's ridge. No riders came, no lawmen, no men with papers and threats. Maybe word had spread, or maybe the mountains had finally decided to keep their own silence. Inside life settled into new rhythm. 3 sets of hands worked now, Cole, outside with axe and post, Sahi tending the fire, and little Naya learning the slow, necessary ways of survival. She was quiet, but not helpless. Always watching. She studied how Cole patched a hole in the roof with hide strips, how Sahi turned scraps and bone into stew thick enough to last. She rarely asked questions, but when she did, they cut clean. "Why do you check the door twice before bed?" she asked one night. Cole didn't pretend not to understand. "Because once I didn't." "What happened?" He met her gaze. "Doesn't matter now. I lived. Others didn't." She nodded like that was enough, and maybe it was. Later, while the stew simmered, Sahi sat near the fire, brushing Naya's tangled hair in long, slow strokes. The woman hummed softly in her own tongue, a melody the girl didn't know, but leaned into anyway. She'd taken to Sahi quickly, not with words, but with nearness, with her small shoulder pressed against the woman's leg during meals, her bare feet tucked beneath Sahi's blanket at night. Cole watched them one evening in the firelight, something tightening in his chest. Not fear, not doubt, but a slow ache he didn't have a name for. He stepped outside to split wood and didn't return for almost an hour. When he did, Naya was asleep, by the stove, quilt drawn to her chin. Sahi stood at the table pouring warm water into a tin bowl. "You left quick," she said without looking up. "Needed air," he answered. She glanced at him. "You always run from good things." Cole stared at her for a long moment. Her braid hung loose down her back, stray strands falling across her cheek. The torn neckline of her dress hadn't been fully mended, the beaded trim still missing where the rope once bit into her skin. Her presence filled the room, not demanding, not shy, simply there. "I don't run," he said quietly. "I just forget what to do with peace," Cole Maddox said quietly. Sahi Redfeather set a bowl down on the table. "It's just a girl and a pot of beans, Cole. Not a war. You weren't there when the peace broke last time. I was fighting my own," she answered, her tone steady. "And I still chose to stay." That stopped him. She stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "I need to know," she said, voice low but sure. "Is this just safety or something more?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to her hands, one still holding the bowl, the other brushing the carved cedar plank on the table. 3 names etched faintly into it: Sahi, Cole, and Naya. No dates, just beginnings. "I don't have the right words," he admitted. "Good," she said softly. "I don't want words. I want to know you'll stay when the ground turns ugly again." "I will." "Then show me," she whispered. Cole reached across the table and took her hand, not rough, not claiming, just touch. Her fingers closed around his slow and certain 2 people, relearning something human. Then from the corner, Naya Riverbloom stirred in her sleep. Sahi eased her hand free. The moment broke, but it didn't vanish. It lingered like warmth that refused to leave. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. Naya insisted on helping chopping carrots with too much focus tongue between her teeth. Sahi let her try. Cole taught her how to sand a fence rail without nicking her palm. She failed, then tried again. Mornings were full of chores, afternoons of mending, nights of quiet firelight and slow talk. Then one evening, just before dusk, hooves shattered the calm, fast frantic. Cole was already on the porch rifle in hand before the figure crested the rise. It was a woman, barefoot Apache dress, torn high hair tangled with brush. She stumbled into the yard before the horse even stopped, eyes wide and wild. But she wasn't looking at Cole. She was staring past him, straight at Sahi, who had stepped into the doorway. The woman dropped to her knees, gasping out words in a tongue Cole didn't understand. Sahi ran to her, kneeling fast, cupping her face, speaking back in the same hurried rhythm. Then she rose and turned toward him. "She's my cousin," Sahi said. "They're coming. Soldiers from the fort. She escaped." Cole turned to Naya. "Inside. Lock the door." To Sahi, he asked, "How long? An hour, maybe. Then we dig in." That was enough. The cabin wasn't just shelter anymore, it was theirs, and nobody was taking it without a fight. Snow still clung to the yard's corners, crusted along the fence rails, but Cole didn't feel the cold now. He moved fast, jaw tight. The rifle came off the wall, cartridges, checked revolver, loaded, always clean, always ready. Sahi was already dragging crates to block the lower windows. Her cousin Taya Moondrift lay by the stove, breath ragged but alive. Naya sat cross-legged on the cot, hands clasped around her knees, silent. Cole crouched near the door. How many? Sahi shook her head. She says 4, maybe 5. They caught others from her old camp last week. She ran 2 nights, no food, no boots. Why chase her this far? He asked. Sahi's jaw tightened. She didn't answer, just went to the window to watch the tree line. Cole stepped outside and began cutting a narrow trench through the snow between the shed and the porch, tight enough to force a single line if the men rode in shooting. He tamped it down with his boots, drove 2 sharpened stakes into the ground, strung wire between them. When he came back in, Sahi was feeding her cousin broth, wrapping her in wool. She rose, wiping her hands on her skirt. You sure about this? She asked. They might come with flags or papers again. If they want her back, Cole said evenly, they'll have to walk in on their own feet. And not one of them will take her screaming, Sahi said under her breath. He met her eyes. Then we make sure it doesn't come to that. They moved like they'd rehearsed it. Naya lit the lamps and turned them low. Sahi sharpened the skinning knife, steady hands, no tremor. Cole pulled down the second rifle, Cyrus Blackstone's still clean on its hook, and laid it across the crate. Then everything went still. The fire crackled. The cousin moaned in her sleep. Naya leaned into Sahi's leg for comfort, and Cole stood by the door. Rifle-ready breath, slow. The storm was coming, one he'd thought he'd never face again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Her face was half hidden beneath the folds of her shawl. Cole Maddox crossed the room to the peg by the door and picked up the cedar plank. The carving wasn't finished yet, the last name only half-etched, but he held it as if it meant more than wood, as if it was something worth defending. Then came the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate. Snow crunched beneath them, each step measured. Men who rode like they'd done it all their lives. Cole stepped outside first, rifle low, eyes fixed. 3 men dismounted in the yard. A 4th stayed on his horse, a pale-haired rider with silver spurs and a revolver gleaming too clean in the firelight. You Cole Maddox? The man asked. Depends, Cole said. You the kind that chase women through snowdrifts? The pale man smiled thinly. We got claims. That girl inside stole military property. She ain't property, Cole said. She belonged to a camp under contract. She said no, Cole replied. Voice calm, but iron hard. And you didn't listen. The man swung down from his horse, slow, deliberate, trained. You sure you want this? Maddox. Cole didn't answer. He lifted his rifle, not aimed, but high enough to make a point. Behind him, Sahi Redfeather stepped into the doorway. She wasn't holding a gun, just the ladle she'd used that morning to serve soup. But her stance didn't bend, and her eyes didn't waver. She's blood to me, Sahi said. Try it. The men hesitated. One spat into the snow, another shifted his boots. The man with the spurs took a single step forward, then a shotgun cracked from behind the cottonwood tree. The shot blew bark from the trunk and froze everyone in place. Etta Miles stepped from the shadows, stock tight to her shoulder apron dusted with snow, face like granite. That's close enough, she said. Town doesn't want you here. You ain't law, the man growled. No, she replied. I'm worse. I bake for all the deputies and I talk plenty. The pale rider hesitated. His eyes flicked from Cole to Sahi, to the wire posts, to the steady figure behind the tree. Cole took a single step forward. Last warning. The man's jaw worked, then he turned to his men. Ain't worth it. As he mounted, he threw a glance back. This ain't over. Cole's answer was quiet. It is, if you let it be. They rode off without another word. The silence that followed felt heavier than any storm. Inside, warmth returned. Naya Riverbloom climbed onto the cot beside Taya Moondrift, curling up without fear. Sahi leaned against the doorframe, her breath unsteady, but her eyes dry. Cole sat down at the table and rubbed a hand across his face as Etta stepped inside, brushing snow from her boots. "You owe me bread," she said. "You'll get it," Sahi replied, voice rough but steady. Etta's gaze moved between them. "You two gonna make this permanent?" Cole looked at Sahi. She met his eyes, then walked over to the peg, took down her small pouch, and set it on the shelf beside the cedar plaque. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. Cole reached for her hand, not to hold her down, not to claim her, but to feel her there. And then, for the first time, he kissed her. Slow, deliberate. Not out of fear, not out of survival, but because staying had become the truest thing he still knew how to do. She leaned into him. In the corner, Naya whispered to her cousin, "I think we live here now." That night the cabin sounded like a home. Snow melted slow through the following week. The warmth didn't come with laughter, but with silence, the kind that settles after danger passes when no one trusts the quiet yet. Water dripped from the eaves in steady rhythm. Mud replaced the drifts in the yard. Tracks began to show again, boots, hooves, bare feet from that wild night when Taya had come stumbling in from the cold and changed everything. Inside the cabin was different now. Not bigger, not stronger, but alive. There were new things, a child's carved spoon, a second shawl hung beside the first, a tiny pair of unfinished moccasins by the stove. And on the shelf, the cedar plaque finally complete. Cole, Sahi, Naya, Taya. Taya's voice had returned, soft but certain. Her Apache accent was thicker than Sahi's, her English still broken, but she moved through the cabin like she belonged. She didn't take more space than she needed, and she gave warmth without asking for any back. And that was enough. Taya Moondrift took to Naya Riverbloom quickly. She'd sit by the fire at night, brushing the girl's hair, and whispering Apache words, soft and slow syllables meant to heal. Cole Maddox didn't understand a single one of them, but he liked the sound. Gentle, careful. Like someone rebuilding a piece of herself she'd once thought lost forever. He didn't ask if Taya planned to stay. He didn't have to. Sahi Redfeather had already started sewing her cousin a new dress-cutting pieces from old grain sacks, lining it with fabric torn from the hem of her own. Cole saw that and said nothing. He just picked up his hammer and added another plank to the bunk frame beside the cot. They'd need more room soon enough. One morning, Naya came bursting through the cabin door, wild-eyed and breathless. "Chickens," she shouted. Cole raised an eyebrow. "We don't have any?" "Now we do," she said proudly, holding up a crate where 3 hens and a rooster squawked like sinners at judgment. Taya named them in Apache. Naya renamed them in English. Cole built them a pen. Sahi baked the first loaf of bread in 3 days. Then another, just to be sure it wasn't luck. By sunset, they all sat outside on crates, stumps, whatever the land offered. Taya stuffed one of Cole's old coats with straw for a pillow. Naya fed crushed beans to the hens. Sahi turned toward Cole and finally asked the question that had hung between them for weeks. What now? He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind. Her torn neckline now patched her hands, dusted with flour. Then he looked at Taya, then at Naya. "I finished the bunk," he said quietly. "We'll build a second coop. After that, maybe we just make it through the next season with a solid roof and no man at our gate." That all Sahi asked, half teasing. That's everything he replied. That night Naya asked if she could sleep beside Taya. Just to listen, she said. I like her words. Sahi smiled and nodded. Cole lifted the cedar plaque to the mantel and nailed it firm. Then he hung Sahi's small pouch beneath it, not hidden anymore, not clutched tight, but displayed. Later, as they lay beside each other, neither spoke. The fire popped soft. Boots dried by the door. A hen outside clucked once like it had something to say, but no one to listen. Then Sahi rolled toward him, resting her forehead against his jaw. I used to think silence meant I was alone, she whispered. Now it just means no one's running. Cole slid his arm around her waist, his hand resting where the fabric still bore faint scars of a torn dress, now mended, now chosen. No one's running, he said. Not anymore. By morning he was marking post holes for the new chicken run, building things that was how he said I love you now. And she understood it better than words. Spring softened the ground. The frost gave way to puddles by the barrels, and green crept along the fence line. The days stretched longer. The sun lingered on the porch, and the smoke rising from morning coffee turned to gentle steam. Inside the cabin, nothing much had changed, and yet everything had. There was a second bunk, now solid and hand-built, where Taya slept with her shawl folded beneath her head, a tiny braid trailing down her shoulder. Naya claimed the cot by the window, saying she liked to see the sky before sleep. The room smelled of flower ash pine and sometimes humming, sometimes Sahi, sometimes Taya, once or twice even Naya. The hens roamed free now, scratching at the thawed ground. Cole had expanded the pen and built a little gate, though Sahi teased him. You ever build your wife a gate like that? He paused, then smiled faintly. No. Never knew how to build one that held without keeping someone in. That day they planted corn side by side. Cole turned the soil. Sahi dropped the seeds, Naya patted them down, and Taya carried water in small buckets, grinning wide under the morning sun. It wasn't just chores anymore. It was living. It was theirs now. When Naya Riverbloom once asked how long corn needed to grow, Cole Maddox replied, Long enough to see who stays. She nodded. Then we better all be here. One golden dusk, Etta Miles came riding up again, not with a shotgun this time, but with a saddle weighed down by cloth bundles. She didn't announce herself, just arrived, steady and calm. Inside the bundles, boots for Naya, shoes for Taya. Moondrift, a tin of salt, and a note scrawled in sharp cursive. You made your home louder. That means it's real. She didn't linger, just drank half a cup of wheat coffee, kissed Naya's hair, and rode off before the dark fully took the sky. At the door, she said to Cole, If you ever need anything, don't write. Just send one of those girls down the ridge. That night, Sahi Redfeather stood by the cedar plaque, fingers tracing the names carved into the wood. Are you gonna add more? She asked quietly. Cole leaned near the stove boots, crossed mug in hand. Only if you tell me which ones belong now. She turned her head slightly, not quite smiling, but something warm flickered in her eyes. Still Sahi, she said, just not somebody else's anymore. You ever want it? He said. I'll carve it twice. I'll let you know, she murmured. She crossed the room, then slow but certain, and slid her arms around his waist. He held her tight, his chin resting on her temple. They stayed like that firelight flickering near them while Taya softly sang an Apache lullaby in the corner, gently braiding Naya's hair. Later that night, when the cabin had gone quiet, Cole stepped outside alone. He took in the warm glow of lamp oil inside smoke, curling lazy from the chimney. The corral was full. The fence held strong. The porch sagged, where Naya had jumped off one too many times, pretending to be a writer or outlaw or hero. Bootprints now lingered beside his smaller lighter, but rooted. He looked back through the window. Sahi stood barefoot inside her deerskin dress, now fully mended. The neckline patch wasn't to cover it, was to complete. Her hair was loose, her gaze soft. When she caught him watching, she didn't look away. She walked to the door, opened. It leaned on the frame. "You ever stop counting risks?" she asked. "I stopped counting the day you stayed," he said. She tilted her head. "Then come in." And he did. They sat side by the fire, her legs tucked beneath her, his hand resting on hers. Naya had fallen asleep, curled against Taya, both wrapped in a patchwork quilt made of old shirts, flour sacks, and the scraps of past lives. No grand words followed. But when Sahi rested her head on his shoulder and his hand slid gently to the small of her back fingers, curling in the cloth, he now knew by heart. It was clear what they'd built post by post, word by word, wasn't just shelter. It was family. And no paper, no name, no fire from the past could take that away. Come morning, they gathered eggs. By afternoon, Cole rode into town for hinges and nails. Before dusk, he was already framing a new room. This house wasn't just full, it was growing. And this time, they all had a place to stay. By early summer, everything had taken root. The corn pushed upward in straight, stubborn rows. Inside the window, Sahi stood barefoot. The dress that once hung in tatters was now whole. Her neckline wasn't hidden, it was proud, her hair loose, her gaze warm. She saw Cole watching and didn't flinch. She stepped to the door, leaned into the frame. "You ever stop counting risks?" "I stopped the day you stayed." "Then come in," she whispered. And again he did. They sat by the fire, her legs curled under his hand over hers. The hens had taken to roosting near the cabin's lean-to. One of them had settled in Cole's old boots until Naya lined a box with straw and named it the Queen Spot. The wind softened. It still carried dust and tugged at old nails and cloth, but now it was rhythm, not warning. The cabin, it breathed like something alive. Each morning followed a rhythm. Taya rose first to start the fire. Naya stumbled out next, sleepy one sock, sliding off, climbing the bench like it had always been hers. Sahi came last, not out of slowness, but because she liked to watch the day rise. The way Cole stretched his back on the steps, the ridge touched by gold behind the cottonwoods, the way safety had become more than luck, it was truth. The second room rose steadily, just walls for now. Cole worked on it each morning. Sometimes Taya helped. She didn't speak much, but she measured well and didn't mind splinters. Naya handed nails like a tiny apprentice. "What's it for?" she asked. He looked over to Sahi, sitting in the sun, mending a ham. "Whatever we need it to be," he answered. "A bedroom, a schoolroom, a place to dream. I'll think about it." Naya grinned. The threats hadn't returned. No debt collectors, no men with spurs and false claims. Whatever had kept them away, Judge Garin Flint's ruling, Etta's warning, or the quiet support from the townsfolk who'd seen what this place had become, it had worked. Cole still kept the rifle by the door, not because he feared, but because he trusted this land now. That afternoon, as the warmth deepened just before rain, he asked her. No speech, no ring, just a look in the quiet as Naya napped by the cedar plaque and Taya hummed by the stove, stirring beans. Cole Maddox stepped beside Sahi Redfeather as she stood by the wash basin rinsing the day's dust from her hands. I've been thinking, he said, his voice steady, that name of yours. You ever want it on the wall again? She turned, eyes narrowing softly. And where would it go? He nodded toward the beam above his own carving. Right next to mine. And what would it say? He took a breath, chest tight. Yours. But mine too, if you want it. Sahi didn't answer right away. She wiped her hands on her skirt, brushed a streak of flour from her forearm, then reached up and gently touched his jaw with her thumb. Only if it stays mine first, she whispered. He nodded. It does. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. Then, yes. The next morning he carved it slow, not deep, not fancy, but sure. Sahi Maddox. Beneath it a small symbol she asked for 2 beads and a thread. Not for beauty, for memory. 2 days later, Etta Miles rode in with a bundle of cotton cloth and a half-burnt sweetbread loaf. That for celebratin', she asked, nodding at the carving. Sahi smiled. That depends. On what, and if you'll stand beside me when we speak it out loud. Etta sniffed. He listens more than he speaks. Might just be worth saying. The wedding was quiet. Just before sunset, beneath the cottonwood, the tea brewed steady. Taya Moondrift braided Sahi's hair. Naya Riverbloom carried the cedar plaque, like it was something sacred. Cole wore his cleanest shirt, the one she'd sewn for him, stitches tight with care. The vows were short. The promises even fewer. But every soul stayed. That night they lit 2 fires, one in the stove, one in the dirt outside. They sat around it, roasting beans, tearing flatbread, watching stars pierce the dusk. Cole held her hand, their fingers laced like roots. Taya leaned back on her elbows, face turned to the sky. Naya, full-bellied and question-worn, drifted to sleep with her head in Sahi's lap. Behind them, the cabin glowed. Not grand, not new, but whole. Because what they built wasn't just a shelter, it was a place no one had to run from anymore. And that they all knew was something that could last.